Story 1. Driving on a dark highway in light rain. My 6-year-old daughter started crying and getting panicky. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "The accident is going to get us." Needless to say, I panicked and pulled over to wait out the rain. Story 2. My younger son went through a phase where he referred to the time before he was born as when I was dead. Story 3. My stepson was 3 when he came out of his bedroom terrified and crying. He said there was an old man sitting on his bed with a suitcase. Took an hour to calm him down. When his dad and I started asking questions, he told us the man came out of the closet. That closet always made my hair stand on end. The child never knew I was scared of it. Even today, at 13, he remembers it. Story 4. My niece was in the sick room at the daycare, babbling to herself while coloring. We asked her who she was talking to. "Uncle Stinky. He's showing me how to draw a bear. My brother, an artist, died before she was born. My kids called him Uncle Stinky, and together they drew a series of bears. He carried the drawings in his portfolio so they could take them out for art class and gauge their progress. No one other than my kids, husband, and I knew any of this." Story 5. I worked with a young boy who would wet his pants and then say, "You dirty little pig." I could tell he was hearing that at home. Story 6. My child was 3 to 4 years old and used to always talk to her grandfather. She would tell us stories about things he had told her, and they would sing songs together. The only problem was he passed away when she was 2 years old. The songs surprised me the most because she had never heard them but would sing them. One night, she sang the wrong words to Pearly Shells. She stopped, said, "What, grandfather? Oh," and then sang the correct words. Yes, that gave me chills. Story 7. Once, a 10-year-old told me he wanted to die and had planned to kill himself. I have no idea why the hospital thought mixing the adolescent and child psychiatric wards for a few hours would be beneficial to anyone. Story 8. I used to do tax preparation for a living. One day, a man stopped by my office with his 5 children to drop off his tax paperwork. He left the children in my office while he ran to get something, saying he would be back in a few minutes. While he was gone, I heard the kids talk about how their father mistreats their mother, who leaves their children with a tax accountant during tax season. Story 9. I can't really think of anything a child has said directly to me that was unsettling. But the other day, a child made me feel a bit strange. I work in retail, and I always like to interact with children. Sometimes I have a conversation, but usually I smile and wave, and they either smile back or sometimes they're shy and hide behind their parent. The other day, I smiled and waved at a little girl who was maybe 3 years old. She looked me in the eyes with a very adult expression, frowned, and gave me a thumbs down. It was a bit unsettling, I guess. What did I do wrong? Story 10. The little kids on my mom's street were always running wild outside. One day, I was walking down our driveway and saw a little girl across the street drowning her baby doll in a kiddie pool. I asked her what she was doing, and she said, "This is what happens to bad babies." I babysat another girl on that street. I showed her our juicer and asked if she wanted any juice. She replied that she wanted to put a human in there and drink bone juice. Felt like a scene from a horror movie in that neighborhood. Story 11. Back in the late 1990s, I did my student teaching in an early childhood special education class. All the kids were great, but there was one little boy, Bradley, who was about 4 years old and as cute as a button. One day, his mother informed us that she had woken up to him standing over her with a knife, saying, "They told me to, Mommy." A few days later, during circle time, Bradley, who had been sitting on my lap and sucking his thumb, got up and walked directly to the back of the room. He stood there silently, facing the wall and nodding his head. A minute later, he settled back into my lap and said, "I'm sorry, they needed to talk to me." He then plopped his thumb in his mouth and put his head on my chest, where I'm sure he could hear my heartbeat racing. I still think about that little boy. Story 12. During a family reunion, one of my young cousins, who was about 5 years old at the time, came up to tell us, "Someone is committing nudity." When they pointed to where it was happening, we all saw a woman in her 50s looking disoriented, walking around the baseball diamond. The police arrived and arrested her. Story 13. When my daughter was 3 or 4, she asked me a few times, "Do you remember when I was your mom and you were the baby?" Story 14. I was watching a child overnight, and about 10 minutes into the night, he looked at me and said, "You know I'm a demon trapped in a 9-year-old's body, right?" Needless to say, when he started playing children's music at 3 a.m., I thought it was the end of me. Story 15. I am a hospice nurse, and a 4-year-old said something unexpected during their grandfather's visit before passing away. As the funeral home was leaving with the patient's body, the child entered the room. The child's father began to explain the situation, and the child said, "Grandpa passed away, I know. You don't have a daddy anymore. You don't need a daddy. You can just be my daddy." Story 16. When my son was about 5, he was really getting into music and loved Buckcherry. At the time, his first hit was a song called Sorry. We were driving somewhere when that song was on the radio. "Son, why do you think he's sorry?" "Me, I don't know. It sounds like he had an argument with his girlfriend." "Son, nah. I think he hit her with a stick." "Me, what? No, he's just sorry that they were arguing." "Son, nope. I'm pretty sure he hit her with a stick." Less unsettling but still odd, around the same time while driving, he tells me that he is going to change his name when he gets older. I'm like, okay, cool. "What name?" He says, "Stephen Baldwin." Like, what? He would have had no idea who Stephen Baldwin was. Alec Baldwin's brother. For those who don't know. Small-time actor. That name is very different from his own name. Strangely enough, I'm adopted, and more than a decade later, I found my birth mother. Guess what her last name was? Baldwin. Story 17. It was what my son didn't say that was unsettling. At 3 to 5 years old, he would just stand in the dark, and when I would go to the bathroom, he would scare me. When he was 3, he drew a picture of a tree falling on our house and mentioned that we all went to heaven. That night, a dead tree fell on our roof, leaving us terrified, especially my wife, who was in tears. We ended up staying at my mother's house. The tree was a skinny old, rotted birch, so aside from minor shingle damage, we were all right, but it really freaked us out. Story 18. I used to work at a dine-in pizza restaurant. One day, a mother came in with her son and some of his friends, the kids being around 12 years old. As I was bussing a table near them, I overheard one of the kids' friends say, "I kill animals." The mother replied, "Oh, your dad takes you hunting?" The kid responded, "No. I find cats in the neighborhood and take them into my backyard and kill them." I looked at the mother, terrified, and she told the kid, "You shouldn't do that, and we shouldn't be proud to talk about such things." I think I met a future serial killer in the making. It still sends shivers down my spine how nonchalantly and proudly he talked about it. Story 19. It was me. I was the kid. When I was about 4 years old, I was sitting beside my grandma, and we were looking out the window. An ambulance went racing by, and I said, "That's for Grandpa." She thought it was strange but shook off the feeling and didn't think much of it. A bit later, she got a call that he had fallen off the side of a cliff while hiking. He was still alive and in good condition, just roughed up. It turns out the ambulance that had gone by was for him since it was headed in the direction of the trail he had been hiking on. I also used to talk a lot about my brothers and how both of them died young. One from drowning, the other from a house fire. It's funny. I can still see the house burning even though I've never seen that house in my life. I'm an only child, too. This used to freak my mom out a lot, but she always took it seriously and never dismissed it as a wild imagination. Story 20. I live in a low-income neighborhood. I have seen many kids grow up over the years. Some of them had no supervision, and I looked out for those children. I didn't allow them in my house, and my boys weren't particularly close to any of them. However, the neighborhood kids played together. I was always outside with my boys. All the kids received popsicles and water just like my boys. Watermelon and various summer snacks were shared. I once stopped a young boy, Jacob, from getting hit by another child with a bat. I recognized Jacob's cry because his mother cared very little about him. One day, Jacob came nearby, suddenly exclaiming in utter panic, "I killed a boy when we lived in Louisville." I'm sorry. I told the other kids to leave and asked him if he was serious. He looked panicked and urgently replied, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I asked if his mother knew and he said yes. This child was about 7 years old and had some issues. Maybe he was lying. I hoped that was the case. But considering the problems he seemed to have, I figured he needed a hug, which I gave him before telling him to go play. He seemed fine afterward. They moved shortly after that, and I often think of him but have no idea how he is now. He would be about 23 years old by now. The look on his face made me wonder if he was telling the truth, and it was unsettling. He was just one of those boys who never had much of a chance. But maybe he is thriving. I'll try to think of him that way from now on if he comes to mind. Story 21. I worked next to a daycare once, and a cute little boy walked over and said, What are you looking at, you white lady? I was too stunned to speak. Story 22. My son only said a few words until he was almost 3. When he finally started talking at 3, he would tell me daily about Alex and all the time they spent together. We had never spent time around anyone named Alex, and there was no Alex in the TV shows he had watched, so I don't know how he came up with the name. One day, he saw a boy who was about 6 years old at a restaurant and ran up yelling, Alex! Alex! This lasted about 6 months, and now he doesn't remember Alex. Story 23. My 4-year-old nephew was once asleep in his room when he got up, came to find me in the living room, and announced, If we go to the park tomorrow, we won't come back ever again, so let's not go, okay? He then stood there, staring, until I agreed we wouldn't go to the park the next day. After that, he went back to bed as if nothing had happened. The creepy part was that I had texted my sister about 5 minutes before he came into the room, mentioning the possibility of taking him to the new skate park the next day. Needless to say, we didn't go. Story 24. When my son was around 3, he said he remembered when he was bigger and that people drove by making a loud noise, and that's how he died. He pointed to his chest, right where his birthmark is, and said, See, they hit me right here. Story 25. Not a child, but still a minor. I listened to a teenage girl explain how she was adopted from a certain country as a young child because her adoptive father had a preference for that race. Without getting into details, she was raised for reasons you might expect. None of the counselors or child protective services believed her due to her history and diagnoses. But the look in her eyes and the calm way she told me it didn't matter really made me question. I honestly don't think she was lying. I heard many troubling stories while working with adolescents in mental health, but that one still haunts me. I think about her years later and pray that life has been kinder to her. Story 26. A 9-year-old girl in an art class proudly showed me a clay sculpture she made and then asked, Do you want to keep it? I replied, Are you sure? It looks beautiful. Don't you want to show it to your parents when you get home? She told me with a straight face, No, my mom always throws away the stuff I make, and I don't have a dad anymore, so no one would care about it. I felt so bad for her. I promised to keep it forever, and it's still sitting on the windowsill. Story 27. I was a kid. I had sprained my ankle, and my mom took me to the emergency room to get it checked out. The doctor told me I would have been better off if I had broken it. My response was, I still can. I think I was about 12 at the time, but the expression on that man's face will forever be a core memory. He was straight up horrified. Story 28. One of my children just started crying and begged me to make the scary woman stop asking him for help. Story 29. My son was about 4 years old when I received an anonymous call on my phone. I ignored it. A minute later, my phone rang again with an anonymous number. My son was playing with toys and didn't even look up. But he said, It's Dad calling. I looked at him. He still didn't look away. I answered the call, and it was my husband. Our car had gotten a flat tire on his way to work. His phone had died, and he was calling from a company near where the car was, so I could arrange assistance for him. I looked at my son, filled with confusion, while he continued to play. If my son hadn't said that, my husband would have been stranded because the company wasn't going to let him make another call. We all joke about it now, but it was such a surprising moment. Story 30. It was perhaps a bit more sad than unsettling. I had a neighbor child try to grab my cigarette out of my hand once. I asked what he was doing, and he said he liked to smoke those. Curious, I asked if he smoked anything else. I like blunts, he replied. The child was around 5 years old at the time, and it was about 10 p.m. when he was just outside wandering up to my porch. Story 31. My 5-year-old niece walked into a grocery store with me and her very pregnant mother and loudly declared to everyone, "My daddy put a baby in mom's belly, and now he's going to put one in mine too because he loves me so much." Cue the horrified stares. She then approached random shoppers to tell them about her future baby, which she was sure would be a bumblebee. We had to have an impromptu sex education talk in the cereal aisle before someone arrested us all. My brother and his wife had attempted to explain the new baby in kid-friendly terms, but that just confused the poor girl. Story 32. A man was a truck driver. He was married and had 2 daughters, one of whom was my age and the other a couple of years younger. I was 7 at the time. While driving trucks, he was seeing different women. He contracted HIV and passed it on to his wife before he died. She was unaware. It was tragic to witness. The wife started dating another man, who then contracted HIV from her. She had the children tested a few times, and they were negative. However, the younger girl fell ill, lost weight, and died, later found to be positive. The older girl, Charmaine, also tested positive. We then heard Charmaine recount how she was raped by her mother's boyfriend. He had also assaulted her younger sister, Chennai. She described how it happened. It was haunting, especially accompanied by her gaunt figure, her tears, and the way she cried. The mother's boyfriend was in handcuffs with his head down. It wasn't long before Charmaine's mother took her own life. I remember Charmaine's haunting cries, asking what she had done wrong to deserve such a fate. She was gone within months. There are aspects of sexuality that children should never know or experience. Yet that girl endured it all. Story 33. As a preschool teacher, I had a 4-year-old tell me how much he hated me and claimed I was ruining his life. He threatened to hurt me, tie me up, and lock me in the school to burn it down with me inside. All because I didn't allow him to violently assault another child. His parents were the most willfully ignorant people I had ever met. They did nothing about him tormenting his older brother. I will never forget his name because every day I watched the news, waiting to see it come up in an article about a boy killing his brother. Before he was expelled from our school, I had to fill out a report for a psychological evaluation. He was also one of the cutest and often sweetest kids I ever worked with. He loved me, and I was one of the few people who could calm him. I had also never met anyone else capable of lying the way he did. You could watch him rip a page out of a book, ask him why he did it, and he would look you dead in the eye and deny it, even while holding the ripped pages. If you contradicted him, he would lose control, scream, and cry, but he would never admit the truth. It was as if he believed his own lie, but I had my reasons for not believing that. Story 34. My mom claims that when I was a toddler, I had a glassy look in my eyes and said in a monotone voice, "I hated my other father. He set my legs on fire." Story 35. My family was babysitting a relative's child, who was around 4 or 5 years old at the time, for the 4th of July about 10 years ago. The traffic was so bad on our way to the park to watch fireworks that we were worried we wouldn't arrive on time. This adorable, cherubic child said petulantly, "If we don't get to see the fireworks, I'll kill my family." When we told him that wasn't nice, he replied defensively, "Well, I'll kill myself too," as if offended that we assumed he could dish it out but not take it. For what it's worth, we did get to the park on time to see the fireworks, and he has grown into a perfectly nice child with no criminal record. Story 36. I worked at a shipping store once, and there was a long line of customers. I was the only cashier. A child was sitting on the floor by the door next to his mother at the end of the line and said, "The voices are talking to me again." I froze and glanced up but quickly returned to helping the customers, hoping to get them out of the store as quickly as possible. I told myself that the child was probably just saying it for attention, but it gave me the creeps. Story 37. My daughter spent the night with her grandmother. My mom called me, almost panicked, and told me that my daughter had woken up, looked her in the face and said, "Is my pawpaw not dead yet?" She was 3. He had been in remission from throat cancer for just about a year. The weirdest thing was that only a week before, I had taken a midday nap and woke up crying hysterically. I dreamt that I was viewing my dad's body in a black casket. I told my mom about the dream, and we discussed how strange it all was. 3 months later, my entire family got COVID-19. This was late 2020, and they told us to go to the emergency room if anyone began having chest pains. My dad was vaccinated and had been asymptomatic but began experiencing pains in his chest, so I drove him to the emergency room. He came out extremely solemn, and I asked what was wrong. He informed me that the cancer had returned, and he was being referred to oncology. He died in 2023. I know kids pick up on things, but at her age, we had never told her he was dying. She knew he was sick because she could physically see it, but the first time he was diagnosed, he had a good prognosis, so we didn't discuss dying. For her to say it that way was so strange, and I still think of the dream and her words. My dad was buried in a black United States Army casket. He looked the same during that viewing as he did in my dream. I had never told my family how he looked or what kind of casket he was in. I also never told them about the dream. Story 38. Last Mother's Day, I was in Mass, sitting next to a mother and her 4-year-old daughter. The preacher was delivering a message about mothers and how we should respect, value, and appreciate them. He asked, rhetorically, "If you could harm anyone in your family, who would that be?" The 4-year-old quietly replied, "Myself." I was taken aback and turned to observe them. Her mother quickly covered her mouth, grabbed her by the arm, and dragged her out the back doors to reprimand her outside. Story 39. I am conducting a state-mandated evacuation exercise for an elementary school class using a school bus. The children raise their hands to ask questions. I select one and say, "What's your question?" The child stands up in the aisle, no taller than the seat, and boldly states, "If we die, we die." I promptly reply that will never happen on my bus. I will carry 10 kids out if I have to. I am still shaken by his confidence. Story 40. I was walking with some friends and passed by 2 children. One was probably 12 years old and the other was around 8. The younger child said to my friend, "Girl, let me eat that." We still reference it occasionally for a laugh. However, I am a little concerned for anyone who crosses paths with him once he becomes an adult. Story 41. I squeezed too hard. I need another. The son of a cousin of mine, about 10 years old, explained why his hand was red. He had just killed his hamster and showed no remorse. I was looking at a killer. Story 42. I was in a Marshall's behind a woman and her toddler when the child shouted, "Shut up!" at his mother. Everyone in line collectively gasped. Story 43. I am a few years retired after a 32-year career as an elementary school teacher in the South Bronx. I worked in one of the most challenging schools in New York City that exhibited various social issues to an extreme degree. In the early 1990s, I had a particularly difficult class. Words cannot adequately describe the chaotic behavior present in that classroom. My school was overcrowded, and I had 38 students, 25 boys and 13 girls in my 3rd grade class. One of the girls in my class was named Jessica. Her behavior was alarming. Unless you have taught in an elementary school in a troubled area, it is hard to imagine the actions of this 3rd grade girl. Most people in more stable environments are unfamiliar with such conduct. For a man, the fear of turning his back on a little girl is a daunting thought. Despite her behavior, she was physically a beautiful child, as if she had stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting. One day, she told me that her father had just been released from jail and wanted to see me. That was definitely not something I wanted to hear. Another time, she shared a disturbing story about someone she referred to as an uncle who used to visit but no longer did. She mentioned that her father and his friend were digging a hole in their backyard the previous night. At that point, I decided to stop the conversation. I did not want to share any more stories from Jessica, as they were unsettling. She could have starred in a remake of Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist. Story 44. My 4-year-old adopted son is repeating in a slow, deep, gravelly voice. Mommy and baby on fire. While experiencing a psychotic break. Story 45. I was placed in a psychiatric treatment hospital at the age of 12. One day, they forgot to lock a door, and I wandered in, as there wasn't much else to do. I found a very small child crying on the floor of a freezing cold padded room. I asked her how old she was, and she said she was 4. I then asked her why she was there. She stopped crying, took on a serious expression, and without missing a beat, told me she was there because she had told her teacher she was going to kill herself. I asked her if she was going to do it, and she flatly replied, yes. I stuck a pencil in my ear and tried to push it out the other side, but they held me down and then took me to the hospital. Her demeanor was unsettling, and it was shocking that someone so small could make such a significant and terrible decision and actually act upon it. Story 46. My niece once told me, I know how people die. They stop breathing and then they go to sleep forever. She was only 4 at the time, and it was so blunt and chilling that it made me question what children understand at that age about life and death. Story 47. If you hadn't come and checked on me, I would have died. I worked for my state's Child Protective Services for a couple of years, and I had a 9-year-old say that to me after being brutally beaten by her guardian. I know Child Protective Services gets a bad reputation, and while I am glad I am no longer in that position, it is one of the instances in which I am glad I was able to help. Story 48. I think my goddaughter was around 6 when we planned to go on vacation together. She knew we were planning to drive, and we told her she could bring 1 suitcase because there would be 4 people in the car and we didn't have a lot of space. Then she learned we were going to a castle, Bolt Castle on Hart Island, and decided that she needed a second suitcase for dresses, as she wouldn't know which one she would want to wear until the day of. I reminded her about the 1 suitcase rule, and this adorable angel said to me, I'll sit in the middle of the back seat, and you can build a fort of suitcases around me. Then when we get in a car accident, I'll be safe and you'll all be dead. She did not get a second suitcase. Story 49. A little 4-year-old who had just enrolled in my class via emergency foster placement told me about the night her father bounced her mother's head off the toilet and threw the baby on the floor. Story 50. My niece was about 5 when she told her dad that her deceased grandfather told her to be born again to take care of him. It was out of the blue with no prior conversation. My dad had died 18 years before she was born. It was both creepy and comforting. Story 51. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I assure you I do not believe in ghosts or spirits. When my niece was about 1 year old and still unable to speak in complete sentences, she stood up in her crib in the dead of night and said, There's someone in the room with us. Clear as day. I jumped out of bed, went to check on her, and she just laid back down and went to sleep. That was 29 years ago, and it still gives me the chills. Story 52. My niece told me she enjoys taking her friend's Barbie dolls, removing the heads, and returning them to her friend in a box. Her parents had to take her to therapy. Story 53. She told me her best friend was a zombie who lived in the walls. A few years later, I was coughing and guessed it was too loud. She said, Can you die a little quieter? Story 54. My 4-year-old daughter says that before she was born, she was a ghost. As a ghost, she would spy on us because she couldn't wait to be alive and living with us. Story 55. My son, at 6, told me he would die when he was 10. He didn't, but he had an accident that resulted in a severe traumatic brain injury, which left him permanently disabled. Story 56. I was sitting on the steps with my infant niece when a 3-year-old neighbor came by and said, I'm going to harm that baby with a knife. He seemed troubled. Story 57. Upon hearing the Trans-Siberian Orchestra's version of Carol of the Bells for the first time, my 5-year-old looked me in the eye and, with a low, grave voice, said, This music sounds dangerous. It was both creepy and adorable all at once. Story 58. I once heard my son giggle in his room past his bedtime, so I opened his door. He was sitting up in his bed, making faces at the corner. When I asked what he was doing, he said, Grandpa says I'm a big boy. His grandpa passed away almost 2 years ago. Story 59. A 4-year-old girl is shopping with her grandmother at Walmart. She asks about a magic 8-ball, and her grandmother explains how it works. Shakes ball. Are the shadows real? Story 60. It bothers me that Elon's 4-year-old bodyguard told the alleged president of the United States to be quiet, and that he is not the president, and nobody is questioning that. Story 61. My 2-year-old daughter, who still refers to herself as you, looked at a photo of a barn owl and told me, "You saw one many years ago." I had recently watched The Fourth Kind, and it really freaked me out. Story 62. When I was in foster care as a teenager, there was another kid who was there for a week. They found a home that took in younger kids, and he really didn't talk much. He looked over at me and said, "They told me to tell you they came for me and are coming for you, and there is nothing you can do. You can't hide." Story 63. Can we keep him? We can lock the doors and tell people he was never here. My child, upon meeting the person I would start dating later, went from cute to serial killer in 10 seconds. Story 64. At my last job, a child told me about a time when his father tried to shoot him with a bow while he was drunk, and it missed his head by just a few millimeters. The child was 8 years old and shared the story as if it were funny. I work in group homes, so I have heard many awful things that have happened to children, but this was the first time I heard it from the child himself, and it just stuck with me. Story 65. Once, when my little cousins were around 5 and 7, I asked the younger one to draw me a picture of his favorite animal. He looked at me for a moment, then grabbed a black crayon and started making one big black circle, looping over it again and again. I was a little surprised, so I laughed and said, "Oh wow, what animal is that, buddy?" He flatly replied, "The dark of nowhere." I must have made a face because his big brother, trying to be helpful, said from across the room, "Oh, don't worry. The dark of nowhere is just like a man who's like a shadow." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if it explained everything. If this sounds a little contrived, it's worth noting that their mother is a horror film fanatic, so this wasn't entirely out of character for them. However, that big black void on the page and the kid saying "dark of nowhere," as if it meant something was still creepy. Story 66. I was at a relative's child's birthday party when a girl, who may have been about 11, started singing WAP. That was quite disturbing. Story 67. My toddler started with "Mummy, I like your eyes," and I was all, "Ah, you little sweetheart." Then he followed up with, "I'm going to put them in my pocket." Story 68. My youngest child co-slept with me. I think she was about 5 or 6 at the time. I sat up in bed in the early hours of the morning, looking around frantically. When I tried to settle her back down, she whispered, "They're coming. They want to find us. You have to be quiet, Mama. They'll hear you." She had no memory of it the next morning. I never found out who they were, but I certainly didn't get any more sleep that night. It still creeps me out occasionally when I think about it. Story 69. My 5-year-old sister ran up to me, her blonde curls bouncing, and said, "Guess what? I saw a dead bird. It had blood." The way she said bird blood was creepy. Story 70. My cousin was playing with her imaginary friends. When I asked about them, she said they were twins who died on the swings. We lived a block away from a playground. Story 71. My mom told me that until I was about 5, I would regularly talk about having died in a fire, providing full descriptions of what it looked like. I don't remember any of this at all. When I was about 10, we lost an apartment and our dogs to a fire. Last year, I lost one of my oldest friends to a house fire. Sometimes I think about this and it creeps me out. Story 72. When my now 11-year-old son was 3, he said to me, "I know what you will look like when you die." I asked him what I would look like. He said, "Skinny. Currently, I have terminal cancer and have lost a lot of weight." My daughter, when she was 2, would suddenly appear standing at the end of my bed at 2 a.m. in complete darkness, apparently staring at me. "Is that you, Penny?" "No." Story 73. A few years ago, my son pointed out that our elderly neighbor still had Christmas decorations up on her porch. I suggested that maybe she was leaving them up until Mardi Gras or waiting for her adult children to visit and help take them down. He thought about it for a moment and said, She's pretty old, so maybe she's dead. I assured him that this wasn't true, but immediately tried to remember the last time I actually saw or heard her. It was a busy day, so I forgot about the incident entirely until that night when I saw police cars next door and an ambulance arrive without lights or sirens. She actually was dead. If her passing had been predicted by an adult, it would have been strange, but my son was just 6 at the time, making it even more unsettling. Story 74. My 5-year-old son is obsessed with world landmarks and monuments like the Taj Mahal, the Eiffel Tower, Mount Fuji, and the Christ the Redeemer statue. His favorite tower is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. When I asked him why he loves that building so much, he told me he used to live in Dubai. Story 75. When my nephew was 5, he said he wanted to die and be born again so he could remember what it was like to be a baby. Then, immediately after, he asked for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Kids are so strange. Story 76. Some years ago, 2 siblings were squabbling in the street. A girl about 9 and her brother about 5. The brother was crying, and she kept telling him to stop. When he didn't, she shouted at him, "Do you want mommy to die? No? Well, stop crying then." I've never forgotten this and sometimes wonder what kind of person she grew up to be. Story 77. I am going to harm you. This was said in several variations over 2 days to another child. I was a camp counselor and these kids were around 8 years old. Understandably, it frightened the child who was being bullied. What bothered me was that I wasn't allowed to discourage that kind of behavior. Story 78. My neighbor's child knocked on my door and said that for $1 he would scratch himself with an itchy ball until he drew blood. I told him I would give him $2 to never speak to me again. Story 79. I have a friend whose 5-year-old told me that a friend of mine was gay. I asked him what gay meant, as I was certain he didn't know. He said, "It's a grown man that rides a bicycle." I wanted to laugh, but instead asked him why that was considered gay. His reply was, "Because they wear silly hats and those tight shorts and shirts." Story 80. My friend works at a women's shelter in our city. She has many stories, but she just told me this one a few days ago. Unfortunately, there is a significant drug epidemic here, and she suspects that one of the women living there smokes crack or meth. If you know anything about how these substances are used, you know they are typically smoked out of a pipe. The other day, she was in her office when a mother and her child came in to speak with her. My friend has a diffuser in her office that releases essential oils, creating a mist that comes out of the top. The child approached the diffuser and began mimicking the action of smoking from a pipe, pretending the mist was smoke. My friend was absolutely floored. Unfortunately, she witnesses many troubling situations like this, and although she took the proper action, our system is very broken. When she shared this with me, I was taken aback. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.